Awesome. Cool. Right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining me virtually. My name is Damien Brady, and I've spoken at a whole lot of NDC conferences before. This is the first time that I've spoken from my home, which is kind of a new thing. I've actually managed to get a little bit more interactivity than usual for this session, which I'm pretty excited about. I am used to, for NDC Sydney, being a little bit let's say, under the weather on the day after the party. And I'm happy to announce that I had 3 hours sleep last night. Unfortunately, it was because I have a 2-year-old and not because I was at the Baxter Inn until 3 in the morning. So I still have the same effect though, which is going to be fun. So, right, enough of that. Today, no, he wasn't watching Bluey. Yeah, which is a shame. He was just not sleeping. So fun stuff. I'm going to talk today about CI/CD and beyond with GitHub Actions. You'll see some lights behind me as well. These are my birthday lights, as JK just mentioned. It's actually my birthday today, so happy birthday to me. I was woken up at 3:45 this morning after finishing up with all of these demos and things at about midnight last night. So yeah, pretty exciting. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, so we're going to talk about CI/CD and beyond. And so it's the beyond bit that I'm pretty excited about. I'm seeing all these happy birthdays flood in. That's really nice. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, and also, by the way, if you've got questions and things like that, check out the Slack as well, because there's comments and chats coming up there. I've got that one open on another window too, so I'll keep an eye on that. I'm just going to move things around so I can see it, and we'll get started. So, CI/CD and beyond. GitHub Actions. I don't know how many people have used GitHub Actions before. If you have, you probably will have used it for CI/CD. For those who haven't, you might be thinking, cool, yay, GitHub Actions. Very exciting. What is it though? And it's not just for CI/CD. So usually GitHub Actions is pitched as the CI/CD solution for GitHub. So if your code is in GitHub, that's how you do your continuous integration, continuous deployment. And it is used for that, and it's really commonly used for that. But it's not just CI/CD. And depending on who you speak to at GitHub, you might even find that it wasn't originally intended for CI/CD. It was intended for automation, right? Just for being able to automate stuff to do with your repository. Now, CI/CD is obviously one of those things that you can automate. You can build your application, you can package it up, you can do releases, you can upload things to the cloud, all that kind of stuff. But it's not just for CI/CD, even though you wouldn't know it. So this is a little bit of a snippet from the screen, a screenshot from the GitHub product page. This is all the things that GitHub does. It does CI/CD and secure development, code reviews, apps. It has apps, which means it's a real product. It does hosting, project management, test management, all that kind of stuff. Sorry, team management, all that kind of stuff. But CI/CD is there, but Action's not. If you click on CI/CD, you get this whole thing about automating from the code to the cloud, and it's all continuous integration, all continuous deployment. So you wouldn't know that by looking at any of their documentation or any of their literature that it's just not CI/CD. It's not just CI/CD. So we're going to look at that as our main purpose. So CI/CD as the main thing that people use it for. But we're also going to look at some stuff that's distinctly not CI/CD, just to give you a bit of an idea of the power behind what GitHub Actions can do. Now, I know you probably don't want to sit here watching me do slides. Nobody really wants to do that. So I'm going to actually do some stuff. So let's do some CI/CD with GitHub Actions to show you kind of how easy it is. And then we'll move on a little bit and do some more interesting stuff. So, right, this is my GitHub repository for my application. It's called Tailwind Traders. It's a website that looks like this. We sell kind of, drills and plumbing stuff and equipment and garden centers. It's kind of like a hammer barn, if you are familiar with Bluey, but it's online, right? So there's a whole lot of features. Most of them are not enabled for this demo because that's too hard. But the thing I want you to watch is this. This is the only thing we're going to change. This free shipping for $99 or more orders, right? That's the bit that we're going to change as we make changes to the application. Right. So this is the repository. It's a .NET and Node application. As you can see here, it's 40% JavaScript, about 23% C Sharp, or 41%, yeah, 23. So it's both of those things. And all the code is sitting here in VS Code, everybody's favorite editor, right? Now, I actually already have a workflow set up for GitHub Actions to do some of this stuff. So if we go to Actions in our GitHub repository, and we can see that we've got this .NET Core workflow that I've set up. And it's run a few times. A few different things have run while I've been testing this. But this is what it looks like when that runs. We can see that there was one job, and we'll talk about jobs and the structure a little bit later. And it did these things. It set it up. It checked out our code. It set up .NET Core, Node, did our dependencies, did a build, a test, and then a post cleanup and things like that, and then completed the job. And you can drill in and see what these things actually do as well, and you can get all the logs and all that kind of stuff. Really, really handy, but pretty standard for a continuous integration system. What does that actually look like? What does the definition of this CI look like? Well, you can go to the workflow file for an actual build if you want, and see what it looks like. So we've got the one that was run then, and that happens to be the same thing that I've got in Visual Studio Code. But I've already set this one up. I've kind of jumped ahead a little bit. If you want to set one up for your repository, if you go to Actions and then click on New Workflow over here, it'll give you access to a whole bunch of templates. You can publish a Node package, you can do a Node.js one, you can do Dino, which is, I don't know what that is, but it's interesting to me that it's the third one there. You can deploy your code, obviously, to Azure, Amazon, GKE, IBM Cloud. GitHub really prides itself on not being a Microsoft-only product. And they go to great lengths to make sure that you can deploy to anywhere you want. So you have all of these ones. You can do continuous integration for Ruby, Rust, and so on. And if you choose one of these, or just choose one at random, so let's just choose Rust, it'll give you this, I'm just going to zoom in a little bit, it'll give you this sample workflow. So this is the definition of what that workflow looks like. You give it a name, there's some triggers, environment variables, the jobs that you're running, and the steps that run as well. You also get this really handy kind of marketplace of all of the different actions that you can use, and I'll talk about them a little bit later. Just to see, what's there. You can do, Azure, for example, and you can get all of the Azure related tasks or steps or actions. Sorry. You get nice little autocomplete if you do that. So let's do a learning one. We'll copy that and paste it in here. Oops, wrong one. Anyway, you can see, yeah, all of these different things that you can do. You get really kind of nice autocomplete on some of these as well. So if we're using that one, we can see that we can give it an ID, we can do some if statements, we can give it a name, we can run some scripts, all sorts of stuff. So it's pretty handy to edit in here. And then when you finish, it will be writing a YAML file into your repository. Now, there's a lot of advantages to having your CI/CD definition in your repository, not least of which is that if somebody clones your repo, they don't just have your code, they have the way that you build your code as well, which can be really handy, especially if they're trying to reproduce issues. Yaz asked, does it use Azure DevOps under the hood? And the answer is no, but it uses exactly the same infrastructure as Azure DevOps. So the agents that are used to pick up your code and build and all that kind of stuff are actually the same agents that Azure DevOps uses to pick up and build. The advantages of this are that you get this huge scalability and performance from having everything sitting in the cloud. And Azure DevOps has been a product, or Azure Pipelines has been a product for a lot longer than GitHub Actions. So GitHub was able to kind of use all of that knowledge and that infrastructure to do it. So it works very much the same way. The syntax is slightly different though, you'll see, but the agents that are used to do the work are the same. He also mentioned that Dino is basically similar to Node, but it's written entirely in TypeScript, which is good, actually, love that. All right, so when you have your YAML file, you can commit that directly to your master branch or do it to a new branch or something like that. I've already got one, so let's not do that. We'll leave. What we'll do instead is we'll make changes to our repository directly in VS Code. Now, I'm going to zoom in again just because I'm used to it. I know that everybody's on a on a kind of a computer sitting 3 centimeters away from their face rather than a projector at the end of the screen. So you can probably see anyway, but just in case, let's zoom in a bit. So let's walk through what we've actually got here. So this is our .NET Core build, and it's called .NET Core. We are doing a trigger so that whenever we push to our main branch, we will run this workflow. Right? We have our collection of jobs, and in this case, we've only got one, and we've called it build. It'll run on an Ubuntu agent, and there are a lot of different agents available to you. You can have a look here, Mac OS, latest self-hosted ones. You can help host your own agents, various versions of Ubuntu, various versions of Windows and Windows latest. One thing I will mention as well is I don't have an extension in VS Code to tell me how to do this. This is out of the box, the autocomplete, which is quite cool. I was searching for a really good one and then realized that it was there anyway. So runs on Ubuntu 18.04. You can have set environment variables for it, and then you have your collection of steps. Now there's a little bit more to the syntax and so on. We'll delve into that a little bit more. But this is kind of your basic layout. You have jobs, you have a named job, where you run it, environment variables, and then your collection of steps. Now, our steps, in this case, we're using a couple of different types of steps. We're using actions themselves. So this is a checkout action and a .NET Core action, and we're passing in some parameters. So with is the way that you pass in arguments or parameters to these actions. We're setting up node, and then we're also doing some scripts. We're running a .NET Restore script, and so that will run in whichever agent we're running in. So in the case of Ubuntu, that'll run as a bash script. If we were using a Windows agent, that would run, I think, as PowerShell by default. It could also be just a command line. And so we're doing a bunch of these things. That's really cool. One thing that I will point out as well is if you are using these actions, that action there, action/checkout, is actually, if you go to github.com/actions/checkout, so just that URL there, that's actually almost always a repository. And in fact, I think it is always a repository. So this is the code that is used for that action. So you can always delve into these actions and see what they're actually doing. And then you can go and view them in the marketplace or just read their docs around it. And that goes for whether they're built-in ones, like the actions one, or whether they're ones provided by the community that are in the marketplace too. Paul said, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think actions are a fork of Azure pipelines. I don't think they forked it necessarily. Actions was in the works before Microsoft acquired GitHub. So they did have some things already. I would imagine at some point these code bases converge. I don't know the details of it. I just know that the infrastructure is the same. I'm not entirely sure whether it uses much of the same code base at the surface. I don't think so, is the short answer. All right, cool. So we have a CI build here. We've got our setups, we're installing dependencies, we're doing a build and test, but we're not deploying anything. So we're just doing the CI part. So first thing I want to do is do that. So let's add another task. Let's just collapse that. Let's add another step here. We'll call it publish, and we'll just do a .NET publish. So again, we're just running a command line. We're going to publish it, pass it to a particular output folder, and that'll mean that we'll get something that we can deploy. Great. Now we need to actually deploy it to Azure, and I'm going to use an action here as well called web apps deploy. Now, once again, this is not a out-of-the-box action. This is one provided by Azure, but same thing. That repository is just in GitHub, so you can see what it actually does. Have a look at all the documentation around that and see the code that will actually run when that action runs, which is quite cool. All right, so we are doing a publish, we're doing a deploy to website. A couple of things that we're passing into this web apps deploy, we're passing in the name of our app. So this is our web app in Azure, but we're also passing in a publishing profile, and that's coming from a secret. So secrets are somewhere where you can store variables that you don't want to put in your source code. Pretty bad idea to put things like publishing profiles, connection strings, credentials, all that kind of stuff in your repository. So you need to pull these from somewhere. The way you do that is if you go to our repository here and go up to settings and then down to secrets. And there we go. You can create a new secret, and these are write only. So once you write them, you won't see them anymore. You can update them, but you can never retrieve them. They also won't appear in any of your logs. They'll be blocked out of those logs to the best of GitHub's ability. All right. There are some fancy ways you can get around that and actually dump that stuff out to to the logs if you really want to. But in general, it'll try to protect these credentials and these secrets from you. And then, yeah, the way you use them is you use this syntax, which is kind of your variable syntax for passing into arguments into actions. And we'll call it secrets.publishingprofile prod. Now, just in case you're wondering, the way you get that is if you go to your web app in Azure, this get published profile in the overview. So that will give you the publishing profile. You just paste the contents of that into a secret and voila. Right. So we'll talk about it a little bit more about the actions and things like that as well. I can see a couple of questions. They're super powerful what you can do here, and it's incredibly powerful, right? I'm going to do one more thing here, or a couple more things actually. One thing which is a pretty common thing to do in a DevOps scenario is to separate your CI and CD. So right now, when I make a change and commit to my master branch, my main branch, sorry, it will build my application and deploy it to Azure, right? All in one hit. What I might want to do is build it, have an artifact, a thing that I can examine and deploy through my environments, and then deploy it to a test environment, and then deploy it to a staging environment, and then deploy it to a production environment. I never really want to rebuild my application to do that. I want to be able to deploy that same artifact. So you can actually have more than one job. So I'm going to actually split this out, and we're going to deploy in a separate job. So let's just grab that syntax. We'll just call this one deploy. And then it needs the same stuff. It needs to know what to run on, some environment variables, and then the steps. So I'm just going to copy paste this just to make it a bit easier. There we go. And there's our steps. So this might seem like we've done everything we can. This runs on a separate job. A few things though. One is each job is run on this agent. So I could run this somewhere else. I could run this on a Windows machine. And that folder that I dumped this to is not going to be on that Windows machine. Even though it's still the Ubuntu one, this is a new agent, a new instance. So I need to save this artifact somewhere and then grab it again in the next job. So the way I can do that is I can use a upload artifact action. So this will create an artifact called drop, and it will upload everything in that folder into that drop drop artifact according to that build or that workflow. How do we get it on the other end? Well, you probably guessed there is a similar one called download artifact. So same thing. So be good if I spelt that correctly. Download artifact, and it's the same deal. It asks what the artifact is called that you're downloading, but then the path refers to where you want to put it. Now, I haven't got the code in this action. Like I don't need the code to do this deployment. So I'm just going to put it in a staging rather than looking for the source and the correct location. We'll just simplify that a bit and say, put it in staging and then deploy from staging. Now, one more thing I need to do, which is really important. By default, these jobs will run in parallel. And I don't want to do that because I won't have the build if I need to deploy it yet. So you can make them dependent with a pretty simple keyword needs. So this one needs build, which means that the build job will run first and the deploy job will run next. Right, so now we've got this CI/CD system where we're building our application and we're deploying directly to our test environment. To our production environment. If I wanted to do a test, I could do another deployment and have a needs based on that test one. Another job and have a needs based on that test one and so on. Yeah, so we're doing that. There's a question from Leandro who says, where are those artifacts stored? They are stored in the cloud in GitHub. That's I don't know is the short answer, but they are stored. If we have a look at one of the previous actions that I'd run, let's try. Nope, do this rather than run it and wait for it. I'm just going to show you one that I already did. Deploy to Azure. There you go. So that's got a drop folder, just 443 meg. That will remain kind of attached to that run for as long as you have set that up. Now, I'm not entirely sure whether it's in the settings for the project itself. Maybe it's in Actions. I think so. There you go. The artifact and log retention will last for 90 days. So you can change that if you want. There's also limits to the number of the amount of stuff you can store in artifacts as well. I think it's a ridiculous limit, but you can easily hit it if you have a continuous integration scenario as well. Question from Yaz, could it be Azure artifacts? And the answer is yes, absolutely. The way I would find that out is if I go to the marketplace. So right now I'm just using the out of the box upload artifact. But if I looked for, Azure artifact as in Azure DevOps, that could be tricky. I think that exposes itself as a like a NuGet repository or a repository for packages. As long as you can tie into that, let's just see hypothetically if NuGet, yeah. So if you used one of these, I guess, publish NuGet you could use to upload or to push a NuGet package, that might work. If I search for package, 233. So look, there's ways you can upload to other things. You just use a different action, one that was somewhere else. All right, I'm going to do one more thing, and then we're going to kick this off. And this one little thing is probably going to give you a bit of a spoiler about what we're going to do next. So I'm going to add a step right at the start, which is going to talk to a LifeX bulb to say we're in progress. And then right at the end, I'll do another one which says the status is whatever the job status was. And we'll save that. Save that file. Don't know why it's saying it's still edited. Unsave, there we go. Things are being a bit slow with WebEx, I think. We need to make one more change as well. We'll just say for $109 or more orders, just so we can see that change when it finishes. So we'll add that one. Actually, right, great, push. One thing I also need to do is turn on that light behind me. There. So you can see there's a glowing white globe there. When this kicks off, I think I pushed then, we should be able to go to our actions for this repository and see, there we go, we are now deploying. And you can see that bulb behind me using that action is now glowing. It's kind of doing an orange breathing effect. So this will take a few minutes. So while we're watching that, you can see this bulb behind me, but let's continue on, what we've talked about a little bit so far. Right. So right off the bat, you get access to all of these templates. I didn't scroll down very far, but there's a lot of these templates to get you started. If you have a look at the Azure repository, so the Azure Artifacts repository, there is a huge list of starter templates as well for doing things in Azure. So if you're deploying to Azure or using Azure for anything and using any of those actions, it'll give you samples of all of these fully fledged kind of workflows that you can use on the way through. We had a brief look at what the triggers could be. So we saw that we were just we were triggering our workflow on a push. We could also trigger on a pull request or on a whole bunch of other things. And we'll talk about that in a sec. And we also saw that you could set up multiple jobs and make them dependent on each other as well. So you could run a whole lot of build stuff and then do some deployments in parallel or in sequence or things like that. So there's a lot of stuff you can do there. Let's talk a little bit just briefly about the actions themselves. Now, there are a lot of actions. This is a screenshot I took yesterday, and you can see there's 5,645 actions available in that marketplace. Now, not all of these actions are useful. I mean, it could be part of that scenario where you have 300 VARD apps, which a few mobile phone things had for quite a while. But there are certainly a lot of useful ones. For example, if we click on that link and go and have a look at those ones, let's just quickly see what we've got. Yeah, 5,659 now. If I did a search for LifeX, which is the brand of the bulb I'm using here, it's really hard to do over my shoulder, point at it. And I found two, so we're going to use both of these. The build light is the one that's doing this. It's doing that kind of glowing, and then it'll change color depending on the success of the thing. There's also one which just lets you set the color. So we're going to use that one for a bit of interactivity as well. But if you wanted to do anything at all, you can certainly almost certainly find an action to do it. So if I wanted to do something with machine learning, there's 14 of them. A lot of them are Azure with Azure Machine Learning. There's GKE Argo, a Docker image of your notebooks, chat ops for pull requests, a lot of Argo, GKE, weights and biases, like all sorts of stuff that you can use for machine learning. So if there's something you want to do, you can do that. If you can't find an action to do it, you could either write your own. They're not that difficult to write and very easy to find out, because remember, all of these have their repositories available to you. You can find one that's close and then just modify their code and put it in your own repository. Or you can just run a script. So we saw before we were doing, we were just doing that run command, and that'll allow us to run your script. So there's pretty much an unlimited number of things you can do as part of the actual steps, the actions that you're running. In terms of triggers, there are a lot of triggers as well. So we saw very briefly a couple of them. We basically saw the push trigger here. But there's pull requests, there's pull request reviews, there's comments and labels, issues. Golem is for the wiki, which is an interesting name. I don't know the source of that one. Any check runs. So if you're doing a build validation before you submit a pull request, that check run can happen before you're allowed to merge that pull request. All sorts of stuff here. And this sounds like there's a lot in this list. There's a handful in that list. It does a lot of things. But these ones can also drill down into more detail too. So, for example, if we looked at, let's say, the pull request one, there's also these activity types. So you can filter and say, I only want to kick off this workflow when a pull request is reopened, for example. And they've got an example of how to do that. So on pull requests, the types, you want to kick off this workflow when it's assigned, opened, synchronized, or reopened in this case. So you can do a lot of work there. There's a lot of stuff, information that you get when you kick things off with these workflows, but getting that information can be a tricky thing. And we'll have a look at that in a little bit, how to actually pull the information about that event out, because that's a really hard thing to do sometimes. But yeah, all of these different ones. There's two I want to focus on as well, which are these manual events. So the workflow dispatch and repository dispatch events. We'll look at both of those, so we'll use both of those. Workflow dispatch is basically a manual run. So you can say, I want to run this workflow now. So if you have a workflow dispatch trigger, you'll get that button, and we'll add one in a sec. Repository dispatch is kind of like that button, but for any application. So it's a webhook endpoint, essentially. So you can fire some information off to an endpoint and say, the repository, kick off this workflow with a repository dispatch event with a name. And again, we'll have a look at that towards the end. Now you can see, there you go, light went green. So that build succeeded, that build and release succeeded. Let's just have a quick look just to make sure I'm not lying to you. And if we refresh, fingers crossed, there you go. Free shipping, $109 or more orders. So there you go. We've made a change. We deployed it. We got some fancy lighting stuff going on. I'm just going to reset that to white so we can use it later. Great. All right. let's look a little bit more at the syntax that we were using. So the workflow syntax itself can be tricky, and not just because it's YAML. YAML can be a little bit hard to write. It can be a little bit finicky. There's a lot of people who hate YAML and want people to use XML or JSON. Look, YAML's fine. It's okay. You saw in VS Code that it gives me some nice kind of autocomplete and syntax highlighting and stuff like that. So, I mean, it does the job. So YAML is one issue, but the syntax itself can be a different issue. There's a lot of things you can do. And that link there, demo.ms action syntax, so I'll just go back there. That link will take you to a docs page that you can find in GitHub anyway. Now, the GitHub docs are reasonably comprehensive, but it's sometimes a bit difficult to find out where the information you want is. I'm putting that in a nice way. The information's there, but it's not the most searchable documentation, I'll be honest. This page here is a great place to start. It gives you the syntax for that YAML itself. We have the name, we have our on, so our triggers, we have our environments, we have our defaults, so you can set defaults for things like the shell to use and so on. And then there's all the job stuff. Yaz asked as well, do I cover creating an action for the marketplace? And I don't in this session, no, sorry. The code for an action though can be really easily found just by going to one of the actions and and checking out what they've done. Actually submitting to the marketplace, you can use them directly. You can absolutely use them. I'm not sure the process for submitting to the marketplace though, I'm sorry. I can follow that up if you wanted to send me a message after. Right, so we've got our jobs. So we can see this job ID, this job name. We can set some outputs, and we'll do that a little bit later as well. Some if statements, some defaults for the job itself. We can do some different strategies, matrices and things like that, and so on. There's a lot of stuff in here. So the documentation is here. But sometimes getting the information out from the event itself can be tricky. I would recommend, if you go over here, this is kind of the best part of the documentation for doing this kind of work. Workflow syntax will tell you how to construct that YAML. The context and expression syntax will tell you how to work with the arguments and things in that action itself or in that workflow itself, and we'll look at that in a sec. There's also that events that trigger workflows, which is what we saw before. These are all just the different events that you can use to trigger. If we go to here though, you can see there's links to the events that trigger workflows. The jobs themselves have links to the workflow jobs documentation. So it all links together. One thing which is a bit hard to do though is, so let's say we kicked off a workflow, sorry, events that trigger workflows. We kicked off a workflow that was our, create workflow. So if somebody creates a branch or a tag, there's some information that comes with that event, but how do you find out what that information is? Now, the short answer is it's in the GitHub event object, which is here. So if you go to context and expression syntax and go to contexts, so this is the context upon which this is running under. And you can see there's a GitHub event object, an environment object where you can get your environment variables, a job object where you can get the job context, the steps, so you can get it, the context of the steps and so on. You can drill in and see what's in this GitHub context, and you can see there's an action, there's an event. That's one that you should definitely look at. That has the payload of the webhook, and I'll get to that in a sec. But it has a lot of information about what is running right now and what caused that workflow to run. And then you have your repository, your run ID, your run number. There is this huge, big tree of content that is in the context that your application is running in, your workflow is running in. How you actually get that information out and find out where the item is that you want to find can be tricky. There's one huge tip that I would tell you. If we scroll all the way to the bottom of context, or go to literals and scroll up, you can see here's an example of dumping that context out. So here we're setting an environment variable for this step, which is to JSON and that whole GitHub object. So that'll dump it to a string, a big JSON string, and then we're doing an echo of that GitHub context. Now this is super, super useful for finding out where stuff lives, right? And I'll show you, one of the examples of something that's in that GitHub event later. But if you have your workflow and you can put this step to start off with, then you can just scroll through that JSON and see what's there. So we'll have a look at that in a little bit. But the key here is this kind of echo that GitHub.event object. If you want to know what's in that object, that can be really handy. One thing to be careful of, this toJSON sometimes gives you an object that will fail your build or it'll collapse halfway. And I'm not sure whether that's a maximum string length or something along those lines, but it can do that. I would recommend going with what the documentation says. So set it to an environment variable and then echo the environment variable. For example, if you do echo toJSON GitHub, that whole GitHub object, in most cases, it'll just crash halfway through and the rest of your workflow won't run. All right. So anyway, we've got this syntax. We can look up where things are. We've got all of these triggers that we can use. We've got all of these actions that we can use. We've got all this kind of stuff. So let's move on and we'll do some more not CI/CD stuff with GitHub Actions. All right. So let's jump back here. We'll have a look at our workflow. This is our .NET Core workflow. And I want to do a couple of things to start off with. One is that I want to put a filter on this push event. So this push event, so that I'm not doing a new workflow run every single time. So I can use the paths ignore argument here or property here, which will let me ignore a particular path. So in this case, I'm not going to kick this off if there's a change to that workflows file. Otherwise, every time I make a change to a workflow, it's going to be kicking off. And for this demo, I don't want to do that. But you could do that for your documentation, for example. Maybe you don't want to do a rebuild and deploy when your docs change. So you can do that. You can also include paths specifically. You can also do tags. So only trigger on tags. And you can ignore branches as well. So as well as specifying branches. So you can do a lot of filtering there. You can also, if you did a pull request, for example, let's say branches, this is also a valid syntax too. So this is a bit of the YAML being a bit weird. So we'll also do this in pull requests, for example. So I'm going to leave that there. We're just not going to trigger if I make changes to any workflows. But I also want to do a workflow dispatch trigger. And I don't need to give this any details. It's just a workflow dispatch there. So what this will do when I commit is it won't kick off a new build because I've put this path ignore, but it will give me a button that lets me kind of kick it off manually if I want to. Okay. So yeah, we saw there are a lot of other triggers we can use. We'll look at some of them in a sec, but I just want to do that first just so we're not continually kicking off new builds. Right. What I am going to do though is I'm going to create a brand new workflow, and I can either do that using that new workflow button in the Actions tab in GitHub, which we saw before, or I can just create a new file in the GitHub Workflows.GitHub Workflows folder. So let's do one that'll let us control this LifeX bulb. Now, I don't want everybody committing to my repository. So instead, I'm just going to excuse me while I type for a sec. Oh, there we go. I'm going to do one which is triggered on an issue comment. So when there's a new comment created, so I can restrict by type as well, then I want to trigger this workflow. And what I want to do is I want to grab a couple of secrets, the things to talk to my LifeX bulb, and I'm going to run a few commands. Just before I do, JK asked a question, can we have multiple environments and use different environment variables using the same workflow? Currently using conditions to run specific tasks depending on the branch name. So the concept of an environment doesn't really exist. You can use a convention potentially, and using those variables so that you can look at things like what job is this running, or what job is this running? So if I'm running my deploy to test job, then get a variable called, something we've deployed to test. So there are ways around it, but this is one of the kind of limitations. The idea of environments and deploying to specific environments doesn't quite exist. So it's really, really good for CI at the moment. Not really fully there for CD yet, for deployment yet. So a lot of those concepts don't really exist. So yeah, short answer is yes, there is a way you can do it. You can get around it by using conventions and variables that are named particular ways, but it's not particularly ideal. Yeah, you're doing some workarounds at the moment. All right, let's have a look at what this lifex1 is doing. First, we're just writing a comment, and then we're doing some fancy stuff. Thanks to Jack Skinner as well for navigating me through the bash scripting, which I'm not that good at. We're basically looking at the body of that GitHub comment. So this is one of these examples where to find out where this existed, it was easiest for me to just dump this GitHub event and have a look through the JSON to see where that existed, where that comment was. And it turns out that it's in GitHub event comment body. I'm having a look at any of those comments that contain a valid color hash, so a hex color. So hash followed by 6 hex characters, right? So basically a color. And then I'm setting, and this is a fancy thing you can do as well, I'm setting an output variable. So here, I'm just echoing this, set output to that variable that I've set. So what this will do is it'll make an output variable from this step called light color with whatever value I give it. Now this is just strings, but that's fine for my purposes. So we're stripping out the color, we're setting that to an output variable. In the next step, I'm using this lifex trigger action that somebody else provided, and I'm providing this output variable from that previous step. You can see that I gave it an ID, which I normally wouldn't bother doing, but that ID allows me to specify that when I look at the steps context. So there's another bit of information that I get from here. So I'm getting that light color, I'm setting that light color for 15 seconds, but I'm also only running this step if this step was triggered, or this workflow was triggered from an issue comment. So you can see again, github.event name refers to the event that caused this workflow to run. If it's a workflow dispatch, because that was the other trigger that I have, just that manual click, I'll set it to wait for 5 seconds. So you can control this a little bit more with these if statements as well. Right. So you're probably wondering, so let's just commit this and push it. Lights, commit, push. Now you're probably wondering how you can actually do this, because there's no point having this unless we let people use it. So this bulb over here, when those events kick off, or when those comments kick off, and you can get to the comment itself, so the issue itself, by going to that URL. And just because I'm going to be switching around, let's put it over here as well. So if you're looking at my camera, you can see that QR code as well if you want. So that'll allow those workflows to kick off whenever anybody leaves a comment that contains a valid hash code. So hopefully a few of you watching have gone to here and left a comment on that issue. And we'll be able to work that out pretty soon when that light starts changing color. Right, let's jump back over to here. If you still need the QR code, it's on the my video. So there you go, somebody's changed it to red, which is quite cool. And we should be able to see if we go to our issues, give me an HTML color code. Yeah, we got a few. So the other thing is these might clobber each other. So we can see it changing as well. It'll change for 15 seconds. Somebody else might jump in and change it again. It'll overlap, but we can see this is kind of working, which is quite cool. So please feel free to continue doing that while we're doing the rest, if you want. So a couple of questions. Can you share variables between, say, build and release if they're separated? So the between the different jobs themselves. Yes, there is a way. The syntax is a little bit different. I can't remember off the top of my head what that syntax is, but while people are having fun changing that light, let's go and have a look. I spend a lot of time on Bing looking for these things, but I'm pretty sure it's output variables. Workflow commands, output values, output variables. Yeah, there is a way to do it, I'm pretty sure. Worst case, you could also write an artifact too, like a file that actually contains that. Setting an output parameter. Yeah, set output. I think that's what I was using. So that will allow you to do output parameters. I don't think they're available in other jobs, but I could be wrong. Previous run actions. Yeah, the short answer is yes, there is. I don't know off the top of my head. It may even be that you have to write an artifact and then pull that artifact down. That's one way of doing it. Yeah, sorry, I can't remember off the top of my head, but yes, you can. All right, let's do one more thing. So we've got this fancy one, which is triggering on issues. Yep, we've got a few. Thanks, Sly. That's a great color. Black, nice work. All right, so we've got that one. That's great. What about one more? Actually, I'll do that this way. So it ends up in the right place. We'll do one more for repository dispatch. So repository dispatch, as I mentioned, was a way of hitting an endpoint, an API, basically to allow you to do something, like run a workflow based on some event that happened outside of GitHub Actions. Now, I originally thought that this was a tricky thing to do. But it turns out it's not that bad. Like you don't need to do any pre-registration or any control stuff inside GitHub Actions. You can do it pretty much all through here. So here's an example of a repository dispatch. We're triggering on this repository dispatch event, and we can name the type. We can give it the type anything we want. So this is just a name to identify what that is. So we could do, NDC Sydney as the type. And as long as somebody sends the right payload with NDC Sydney as the event type, then it will work perfectly fine. So we could leave that there. That's also fine. But let's leave it as demo dispatch. We'll run it on the latest Ubuntu, and then we'll just do a hello world and then a hello with the message that came in that payload. So what does that payload look like? Well, let's just commit and push this, because I think the easiest way to do it is just to actually run it. There's not a lot that you need in that payload itself. Let's push that, and we should be able to see when we jump over to our actions that there'll be a new one. Got our LifeX bulb, our .NET Core. By the way, I didn't show you this. In .NET Core, if you go there now, it has a workflow dispatch event, so I can just run that workflow directly if I want. There are also ways that you can supply arguments that are needed. And you can see, here we go, we've got our repository dispatch example. Now, I can't trigger that one because it doesn't have a workflow dispatch, but it has a repository dispatch. So obviously, I've had this before and I've run through a few tests, but this will, let's just clear that. If I do a curl, so the curl basically just lets me do a HTTP post. So I'm doing a post to this URL, api.github.com/repos/the repository owner. So in this case, it's my GitHub organization. And then the repository name /dispatches. So that's the endpoint you need to send it to. You need to give it a bearer token, so a PAT, or a personal access token. You can get that from GitHub. I'll show you in a sec. And then the object you need to send is just a JSON string with event type. That's the only one you need. Event type, which is the name that should match what your repository dispatch workflow says. The client payload can be whatever you want, a JSON object that represents anything you want. In this case, I'm just saying hello NDC Sydney. So if I kick that off, we should be able to see, if we just refresh that. There we go. There's a new demo dispatch event, and we can watch that run. So that build is running. And yeah, we've run our hello world, which said hello world and hello NDC Sydney. So really, really easy to do. And that kind of opens it up to anything you want. Anything that can send a post will work perfectly fine. Right, that's enough for the light. Let's get rid of that QR code. Oh yes, sorry, getting that personal access token. If you go to your profile, the best way I've found, go to your profile, your organizations, and then down to developer settings. There's a few ways you can get to this page here, but developer settings, personal access tokens, and you can create a new token and just use that one. So it's just a string that you can use. Cool. All right. So we've done more stuff. Oh yeah, thank you. Steve put the link to the repo so everybody can keep doing it. Sly mentioned that prior to workflow dispatch, to manually trigger a workflow, previously you could use repository dispatch and manually trigger with the rep request as the demo. So yeah, the workflow dispatch is a relatively new one. That's the button that you can just press in the UI. But yeah, before that you could do repository dispatch and do it via the API, which is handy. Yeah, thanks, Sly. Cool. So what we saw is that there's thousands of actions, right? We saw 5,500 actions. Also, you can just run a script if something doesn't do what you need it to do. We have effectively unlimited triggers because we've got that list of triggers, we've got all the filters of those triggers, but we have repository dispatch as well. So we can trigger from anywhere for any reason. And as far as I can tell, there's no restriction on the number of workflows you can have either. There are restrictions on how many you can run in parallel, but I'm pretty sure you could just fill that workflow folder with as many of these as you want. I haven't seen any limitation. There might be one, but I haven't seen it. Now, undoubtedly, you might be thinking, okay, cool, but what about this particular behavior that I want or this particular feature that I want? And yes, there are missing pieces. GitHub Actions is relatively new. It does some things incredibly well. It does some things not quite as well. Thanks, Yaz. He needs to jump in a meeting, so he's heading off. These are the big things for me that are missing. Approvals and gates, so going through that process of deploying to a test system and then a production system, that for me is super important for a CI/CD system. And so when it's a very important application, I'll still end up using Azure pipelines because I can't really control that nicely. There's ways you can obviously use repository dispatch to go out to an application, wait for an approval, and then come back and continue with a different workflow. But it doesn't quite work for me. So the general CD workflows, continuous deployment workflows, doesn't really work for the way that I work. There's a whole list. So the github.community, GitHub Actions, you can see a whole list of things that people have asked for. I also didn't mention price. The pricing is pretty straightforward. If your repository is public, everything's free. If it's not, you still get pretty generous limits. It's quite similar to Azure pipelines. There are also limitations on the number of concurrent jobs you can use. So for free plans, you can run 20, then it goes up as you pay more money. Mac OS, it's still a bit restricted because those are kind of more expensive machines to spin up to do that work. The other thing I'll mention is the workflow run time. The limit of the runtime is 72 hours. So you can run a workflow for 72 hours and then it'll die, which is incredibly generous. Right. So at the start, we said, GitHub Actions, great. What is it? Basically, it's a tool that lets you do all of the things. Anything you want to do that can be automated with scripts or actions, you can do it with GitHub Actions and trigger from inside GitHub or outside GitHub. Yeah, pretty much anything you can do. It's CI/CD and way beyond that. So I think I've got like 1 or 2 minutes left, but I'll be sticking around on the Slack a little bit longer as well. If you have questions on there, you can always hit me up on Twitter as well, Damo Visa, and yeah, I can answer those questions. If you wanted to get me to try stuff in the next 1 minute and 30 seconds, happy to do that. Otherwise, actually, we've got about 5 minutes. I think I pressed the button for 55. So yeah, if you have any questions, please hit up Slack. I've got one from Steve already saying, on redacting secrets, a few months back, they had some overly eager policies that looked like global search replaced for secret values, which led to some interesting log debugging. Is there a less strict setting somewhere? So I think what Steve is referring to, and correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, if I'm misreading this, is when you have an item in secrets, we make sure that as much as possible, GitHub won't let that hit logs, right? So if you have a the name of a server or something which is not terribly secret, but you just don't really want it in your repository, it'll still try to strip that out of logs. Now that can be a problem if you're feeding it into other tools. If you're saying, hey, write this variable, this secret as an argument to this other tool that I'm using, it might also try to strip that out, thinking, well, we don't want that to become public. So you can't use it in that way. So there's over-eager policies sometimes in how that gets stripped out. The question of whether there's less strict settings, in GitHub Actions, there's not really. It's either in your repository or it's in a secret. You can also get your secrets from Key Vault and things like that. But yeah, secrets is this very one-dimensional kind of thing. It's a key and then a secret value, and then GitHub will try to keep that out of the logs or anything like that, which can have some side effects. Yeah, the solution is put it in your repository, which is not a great solution in some cases. Yeah. Azure Pipelines, though, if you wanted to use that tool, it has the ability of setting a variable that you can have as secret or just plain text. And it won't try to block any of the plain text ones as well. But GitHub Actions, no. Yeah, so configuration rather than secrets, yeah. In your repository is kind of the answer, I'm afraid. Cool. Any other questions that I'm seeing? I'm seeing a thread as well. Oh, I just tried to move my mouse to a different machine, which I know you can do, but I didn't want to. All right, not a relevant question. Cool. Thanks, Anthony, for coming as well. And yeah, I love the light thing. Those actions, there's more and more every day. When I did this kind of demo a couple of months ago, I think I couldn't find a decent action to control those lights. Now, yeah, it's all over the place. So the hardest part of doing that was actually stripping the hex code. I'm not great with Bash. I should have just written something in C# and called out to it. So question as well, for GitHub Enterprise, it seems the underlying VMs have to be taken care of. How complicated will it be to deploy or maintain GitHub Actions? So for GitHub Enterprise, I understand that there's a hosted GitHub Enterprise, but also GitHub Enterprise that you can install yourself. Deploying and maintaining GitHub Actions, that's a good question. I don't know. If you wanted to email me or send me a tweet or something like that, emails at Microsoft, by the way, are generally firstname.lastname@microsoft.com. If you wanted to email, I can find a way of doing that. JK says, do you know a good action for making HTTP requests? Not off the top of my head, but I do remember searching for that. So one thing that you can see is how many stars the repository has as well. So HTTP request has 8 stars, seems to be getting used a bit. Pretty straightforward, so that's one. There's also, if you're running, yeah, you can also run your own scripts if you wanted to do that. But yeah, there's plenty of those. I don't know which one is the best. It's one of these marketplace things where you kind of pick one that other people are using and hope that that's great. So JK's using the FJ01 with, see if I can find this one. Yep. It looks like that one. Yeah, he's using that one to reset Cloudflare cache, but it's flaky. Try another one. Is my answer. It's not a great answer. But yeah, if it's flaky, that means there's probably something going on there. The great thing here, though, is that you can go to that repository, and if you wanted to, you could fork it and use that action yourself from your own instance of that repository. So you can have a look at what he's actually doing in this, or what they are actually doing in this, if you wanted to do it yourself. So that's an advantage and a bit of a disadvantage. Yeah, not many options a few months ago, but now seems to be a lot of options. Yes, I've found that too. Certainly a thing that happens is that the numbers explode. Cool. Awesome. I think we are almost at time. I think I've got about a minute left. So thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming, and hopefully you enjoyed the little bit of interactivity that we get across the globe or across the country. So thanks so much. I'll see you next time, hopefully in person.